And as soon as Mr. Newberry gives a thumbs up, we'll be ready to go. I think we're ready.
With co-chair's permissions, I'm going to go ahead with the roll call. Thank you, Member Goff, Member Larson. Here. Member Corvington.
Here.
Member Collier. Member Jailing. Member Bauman. Member Hildreth. Member Alou. Member LeMay. Member Marshall.
Present.
Member Glowski.
Present.
Member Vollmer. Member Becker. Member Webster. Councilmember Ottenberg.
Here.
Councilmember Dodwell. Co-chair Caldwell.
Here.
And co-chair Flasher.
Here.
Thank you.
So as Ed described, we're hoping to maybe jump ahead in the agenda here. I guess, do we need to take a vote for that? Is that appropriate, Mr. Marshall?
Could do a motion. So I'd make the motion that we readjust the agenda to deal with the next steps prior to approving the minutes. So just change the agenda to start with next steps to see if we get more members. So I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
All right, seconded by Mr. Glowski. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, so we'll proceed with the next steps for task force members. Was there, I guess, A is starting off with the discussion of presentations from the outside agencies provided at the October 2021 meeting. I guess that's just opening up the door for anyone who has comments about those meetings. If you have anything you want to share about that experience or ask any questions or anything like that, this would be the time to do so.
I just wanted to say, and I think that we commented on this at the end last time, that I really enjoyed hearing from all the organizations, and it felt like the months of work of trying to get that organized. I thought it was really beneficial. So just wanted to say that.
I agree.
Great. Yeah, I agree too. I mean, it went from this whole thing being a little unclear as to what it was. And for the first time, as those meetings were going on, I felt the real value of what we were able to provide for the city here. I was really excited when we got done with that whole presentation thing. Mr. Marshall.
Were there other people who elected not to make presentations, but either sent in videos or additional information, or just didn't hear from anybody?
Mr. Chair and Madam Chair, we did receive additional responses to the questionnaire, but other than the one video from the church, we did not receive any other additional information beyond the questionnaires. And those questionnaires, I believe, were provided for the last meeting.
And I know, Ed, if I'm not mistaken, Joe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but at one point it seemed like we might have had as many as 10 that were interested in making the presentation, but they wanted to do it at a different time than what we had made available to do it. They wanted to do it in the, typical 9 to 5 work time hours. And that just wasn't what we had working for our group as a whole based off our meeting times.
And Mr. Chair and Madam Chair, I concur with the sentiments of Ms. Caldwell. the thing I liked best about the presentations were just the amount of enthusiasm that people brought to them and just how you could tell they were committed to what they were doing. And it was, so to speak, a labor of love. And actually, it did kind of create a certain level of enthusiasm regarding the task force and the things we've achieved. Thank you.
Yeah, to me, it really built like this desire to want to be able to allow all these organizations to make that presentation to the public in some way, shape, or form, right? That was kind of the mindset about the college fair thing at one point, was just being able to do that if possible. And so I thought that, like you said, seeing their passion for their organizations and stuff, you wanted them to be able to share that passion with other people. All right, so the next thing is the consensus on the final draft of the spreadsheet. Has everyone gotten a chance to look at that final draft of the spreadsheet? And does anybody have any comments, questions regarding that?
Looks good.
Yeah, so this is Dan. I'm not sure that this is in a format that I was anticipating. I think there are many columns that don't need to be included if it's going to be disseminated to the public. I think this is the draft that the task force was working off of. So what I would propose is that this be put into a format that doesn't require scanning across the screen on an Excel spreadsheet, and instead is in 8.5 by 11 format that has the name of the organization, what services they provide, combined with what type of organization they are, and then contact information. The only other thing that I think should be included, and this is just my view, is whether there are volunteer opportunities, and it doesn't look like we have too much information on that. So that might be my second recommendation, that we confirm with these organizations whether or not they have volunteer opportunities. And the rest of it, since there's so many blank spaces, that we condense it down to 3, 4, or 5 columns.
Thank you for that suggestion. I tend to agree. It is hard to look at. Curious about other people's thoughts.
Spreadsheets can always be tough to wade through when there's a lot of data involved.
Yeah, I would assume it was going to be converted to a HTML web page or something where that was going to make it look a little nicer. But what for the final output, was that the intent?
With the permission of the chairs, I believe so. As you know, when the task force was asked to kind of provide what they thought were organization, agencies, entities, we wanted to capture as much information about them as we could. But certainly, I think the direction that's been suggested is one that would make the tool better. And so certainly, if that's the consensus of the group, we can modify the Excel spreadsheet, get it in a format that's much more user-friendly, and then get it back to the task force for their consideration.
I mean, right now we obviously don't have a quorum. Would that be something that we would then need to have a meeting to vote on, or is it something we could more or less approve via email, thumbs up type thing?
Well, certainly, the preference always to the department is to have a meeting. I don't want to necessarily impose upon you all again and those that aren't in attendance, but I think it's better that we all talk about the final product, since that's the final product, as Mr. Larson said, will eventually be on the website of whatever organization or entity that is hosting it.
That makes sense. Mr. Marshall.
maybe as we kind of think through it, if we were able to, excuse me, come up with that 8.5 by 11 sheet and have like the 5 categories, but I do think it's important about how to volunteer on it. But if that would become the blank template, then maybe that becomes the way that when there's a new organization that says, hey, we'd really like to be part of that, here's the 6 things you need to fill out. And then as long as it meets the criteria, then it could be posted to the website. And so, you know, if people have a link to a video or a YouTube or something like that, they could put it right on there. And then it just kind of summarizes it, but you kind of come up with those 6 or 7 categories. I do, when we started, I mean, that was a gigantic sheet, but we needed to kind of use that to get started and narrow it down. But I think if you just get it down to the point, here's what they do. If you want to volunteer, and you know, if they want to put their video up or their website up, it's there. And then I think that would be a good way to keep it going long term, as people can, you know, the organizations that do it can be told, you know, you could come in once a year and update it, or 6 months or something like that. Kind of put the burden back on the organizations to update the information for the city instead of the city trying to go back to them. So just my thoughts.
Thank you for your insight there. I appreciate that.
So my other suggestion, I know we started off in Excel, and I understand that and appreciate that that's the way to start. But I would like to see maybe the condensed version of the Excel spreadsheet, and then a more user-friendly version that does not use Excel, that just has the name of the organization, contact information, and then a brief paragraph underneath about services that are available, services that are provided, whether there are volunteer opportunities. So that it's not as formal in a chart form.
Yeah, and that, on those services and stuff, is that something that we could make like accessible via a link next to the organization, as opposed to having a elongated paragraph underneath each organization? Just a thought. That way, if you see something that catches your eye, you can then look into getting more information about that organization.
Mr. Chair, I would, sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of it's difficult to tell from some of the names of these organizations what exactly they do. So I was just thinking, you know, we have some on here that are described. Diversity and equity education, animal rescue, you know, just a few words to describe what it is that they do. Some of them are obvious, St. Louis Community College, but others are not. But I think the link is a good idea for more information. Users can click on the link.
Does the city have a web author?
Generally speaking, Mr. Corvington, it's certain staff members.
Thank you.
So I think we've hit up the action on the final draft of the spreadsheet of organizations as well, just by having this conversation, and Mr. Glowski's great comments there. That I got the overall impression that everyone agrees with those comments as well.
Yeah.
So that takes us to the hosting of the spreadsheet of organizations. And Joe, you know, you and I were talking a little bit offline, but maybe you can share any possibilities that you know of. Otherwise, we need to kind of have this conversation as a group to see if maybe someone has a good idea.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the task force, when this process started a while back, the goal was to have the spreadsheet hosted by an outside entity other than the city. And at times that outside entity was identified as the Wildwood Business Association as a possible candidate. Certainly there are probably others that just I don't know of. I think the thought is that to host such on the city's website might not necessarily be the best location. And so, yes, if any of you have suggestions of a possible host for this organization spreadsheet, certainly the city would be open to any and all and be glad to contact them and explore their interest as well. Thank you.
I'm just curious why the city website would not be a good place to have this posted.
Well, Mr. Glowski, that's a very good question. And I guess there's just maybe a little internal debate about how it would be managed, the resources required, et cetera. But certainly at the end of the day, we don't want to see the efforts of the task force not placed somewhere where they're available and kept up to date and certainly provide the service we all hope.
Joe, I have a question, and I'm not on the website for the city very often, maybe not as much as I should be as a council member, and maybe Mr. Marshall or Mr. Ottenberg or yourself obviously know this. Is the WBA promoted via our website in general or not?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Newberry, but I believe we do have a link to the WBA, but it's in our economic development section.
So if that's the case, could we potentially, I mean, obviously we need to talk to Mr. Cross or whomever, potentially do something similar with this, where it's not necessarily promoted via our website, but there is a link or something that would take you there, and maybe it then gets attached with the WBA. I don't know.
Well, again, certainly there's any and all options out there, and I don't necessarily want to be the naysayer here on city hosting the product of your all's efforts. As I say, we were hoping it could go elsewhere, be a vibrant tool, and not something that's just a part of a website that has thousands and thousands of bits of information. But at the end of the day, I think the commitment of the city is that we do something with the work of this task force that helps our residents.
Yeah, so my thought would be, since we're putting this into a static document, that it be promoted in the Wildwood newsletter. Could put a nice blurb in there, volunteer opportunities or services for residents. And then just have a link to the document on the website, and somewhere on the website under residents, refer to this list of service organizations serving Wildwood, and then direct the user to the document. The only thing that I think that would require any time or effort would be to update the static document. And I don't know, that's something we would need to consider. And I understand that the city probably doesn't have the resources to do that on a regular basis, frequent basis, but maybe once a year might be doable.
Thank
yeah,
you.
I thought annually would be the most appropriate measure as far as checking in to make sure everything's up to speed. That doesn't necessarily necessitate a whole meeting of this whole task force, because I don't know where everybody's interests will lie once this is kind of brought to a close. But yeah, something to discuss there too, as far as other considerations.
Mr. Flasher. Just wanted to tag on to something that I think Joe alluded to, which is that if this information was hosted on the city's website, that's all well and good. But for those who don't normally take advantage of the information that's on the city's website, at times it can be challenging to try to drill down and find exactly what it is that you're looking for.
I know we went back and forth on this towards the beginning of the task force was there, did we reach out to Wildwood Business Association to ask if they'd be interested in hosting it?
To
Madam
my,
Chair,
I don't know if anybody from the staff has. Joe, you go ahead. You might have something. Okay, well, I was gonna say I have not yet. I was kind of waiting to see what the final product even was, but I can reach out to Miss Edens, who's the council chair for the economic development stuff and has that relationship, and kind of see if she can connect the dots for us a little bit there. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, sorry I was so late.
You're earlier than 9 other people still, so you did.
Okay. I had kids.
My only comment would be if we're hoping to make this accessible to as many residents as possible, that including it somewhere on the city website, even if it's a link to the business association, would be helpful. I don't know how many people visit the Wildwood website, but there's probably a small fraction of that ever go to the business association.
Right.
Website.
I think that's what we discussed. That's what we discussed before as well. I think there was a concern about legal concerns about posting on the city website too, if I recall. Joe, maybe you recall, but that's what we discussed before was a link.
Mr. Larson, you're correct. There's always that proverbial, we know all of these organizations. We feel these organizations are strong partners in the city of Wildwood. But what about organizations we all don't have consensus on and may not offer services we feel appropriate for this particular list? And so we're limited in who, in certain instances, who we can say you're on the list and who's not on the list. And that was one of the major concerns.
Does anybody else have any comments, questions, recommendations in regards to potential hosts of our work here? Mr. Marshall.
I just think the challenge you're going to have with the Wildwood Business Association, they're just a group of volunteers as well. And as they go through new people every year, it's a great organization, and we're a member of that as well from the Lions Club thing, but we might go 2 or 3 years and never get a dues membership thing because somebody didn't follow through on it. So I guess the challenge would be is if we feel the information is right that we want to get out there, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be on their site, but I just don't believe pushing it off on them would relieve anybody from making sure that it gets updated anymore. I think it's the challenge we have is if the people or the organizations are willing to support the program, then I think we need to have the minimum that it's their responsibility to make sure it says what we think they're allowed to say. And then that information is their responsibility to update. If it's not updated in 6 months, it just drops off the list. I just think that some of it shouldn't always be the city's responsibility, but I do believe that for those organizations that want to do it, then that we ought to have that venue in order to do it. And I totally agree and remember when we talked about this, there are some liabilities there, but I think it'd kind of be interesting to see, and I know the city attorney is very busy, but there's been a lot of time and energy put into this project over 25 years of how do you get a community to be more involved in it. It'd be interesting to see the list of the 4 things that organizations have to do or what they can't say or whatever, if it truly was a concern about that challenge. Because regardless of what it is for the city, it's going to be the same thing for the business association. They may not know it, but I think that's where we probably ought to look at it and say, okay, and you hate to just be something, but what's the worst things that can happen? And what can we do as we set it up to say, okay, whoever is representing that organization, they need to sign off that these 4 things have been acknowledged. I don't know there's fining or anything. I just think sometimes if you just make it a little bit harder for them, they'll drop out, and the ones that are willing to do what they need to do will stay in and make it work for you. But I would just be concerned about it. I mean, if they'd be happy to take it over and do it, I think that's great. But I think there are fewer people go to the Wildwood Business Association website than go to the City of Wildwood site. So somehow to get a link on there or a link to a document that you could open up and limit that, and maybe put waivers on the bottom of it or something. And people can always change website links, but protect the city by putting disclosures on the bottom of it, if that's another way to do it. So just a thought.
To the task force members, and certainly the department isn't advocating the Wildwood Business Association. To some of these organizations, it probably wouldn't be a very good fit. And so I guess what I would like to suggest is maybe letting the department do some further research, see if there is a way that we can figure out how to host this, either not by the city, but certainly by an entity that would take it as serious as the task force members have over the past year plus period of time.
I think that's great. I mean, I think it seems like inevitably we're going to need to have one final meeting, since we don't have a quorum to do some of these votes and things like that. And we've had some really good suggestions here that we need to all agree on. So given that that's the fact, and that this isn't the last meeting like we at one point anticipated, yeah, I think that'd be great to see what we can do and if there is an option there. And I really like the idea of getting it in the Wildwood newsletter, where it's something that's, you're not searching for it, but it's coming to you in your mailbox or whatever. I thought that was a really fantastic idea.
And I would go as far as the newsletter, because then we could put a link to the document wherever it is hosted, and people could access it very easily via their smartphone, iPad, or computer.
Just thinking about who could host it, Joe, one thing to look at, maybe even some of the organizations that are on the list might be willing to do that, which might give them further incentive to keep it updated too.
Mr. Larson, thanks for the suggestion. I think that's maybe where we'll start, just going down the list and seeing who might have the greatest number of resources and could accommodate it and add it without a lot of distress. So thank you.
What about maybe the possibility of the community college, Joe?
That was one I was thinking about as well, Mr. Marshall. They have a big footprint in this city of Wildwood and across the, obviously, region. And it'd be worth a conversation, I think, with the representatives at the Wildwood campus.
They may also have the students who are looking for internship projects to manage something like that too.
Well, if there's no objection on the task force members, that's probably where the department would start its conversation.
I think that sounds great.
Again, pardon my talking so much, but in terms of the list, I had a couple of questions to the task force. In going over the list prior to tonight's meeting, I noticed that we didn't necessarily have anything relating to the American Legion post, the VFW, things like that. And I know it's somewhat timely at Thursday's Veterans Day, but I know that they are very active in some communities. And so I was just wondering if the task force would mind if we explored those couple of organizations to see for possible inclusion on the chart.
I think that sounds great.
Again, if
It's
there's
like-
an,
Ever flowing document, right? We can always add things if it feels appropriate.
Yeah, I think that to your point, in terms of how we're going to keep it updated as well, do we have the criteria for inclusion? Because if we're wanting, to your point, we want to keep organizations, submitting their information, keeping it current. Do we have the information, the criteria to tell them, who's eligible?
with the permission of the chairs, I think so, Mr. Larson. We kind of identified those organizations that offered services directly to Wildwood residents. We preferred organizations that were based in Wildwood, but not all are, obviously, because of the scope of their services. And then we were looking at different organizations. They could be faith-based, such as some of the churches, service types, etc. So I don't think we have it necessarily in a concise statement. It was kind of an evolving discussion. But
Right.
certainly, if you want something like that, we could probably have something prepared for the next meeting just to have you all verify and ensure that we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, perfect. That's what I was thinking, is that if we were going to have another meeting, that maybe we'd have that as well, because that would help the ongoing maintenance of it.
Anybody else have any comments or suggestions?
Just a
You remuted there, Roland. You started and then it cut out.
Sorry about that. Regarding the newsletter, is that a city publication or is that published by another entity for the city?
Mr. Corvington, the Gazette is a publication of the city of Wildwood. It's done twice a year, and it's a direct mailer to all households. The newsletter is published by the Department of Planning, and that's weekly on Fridays.
Thank you.
So do we want to try and come up with another meeting date? I guess the question would be, do we want to try and knock this out before the end of the year, going into the holiday season, or do we want to kind of bypass the holiday season and pick it up here in January and hopefully bring it to a close?
My inclination is to say after the holidays, just because it's crazy, but that's just on my end.
I
It's a
agree.
motion, I'll second it. No, to her point exactly, it's getting very busy once you get past Thanksgiving.
Yeah. So Travis or Joe, what's open, I guess, come January here?
Well, I think as we come right out of the new year, there's a number of available dates that first week, as well as the second week. And so if there's no objection on the task force members' part, that's probably where we'll start, with a couple of dates for your all's consideration. And I ask this question only in the hope that we can garner a larger group. Would there be a benefit to starting the meeting a little later, 6:30 p.m. or 7 p.m.?
Yeah, I think some of these cases, I mean, a lot of the people that are on the task force, well, not a lot, but a handful of people on the task force were people that other council members or whatever knew. And so my thought is that we reach out to some of the people that haven't been coming as much, but have come in the past somewhat regularly personally, and say, hey, really like to have you here so we can kind of bring this all to a close. And I'm happy to do that with the folks that I have some sort of a relationship with. And I mean, I'm even happy to do that with people I don't have a relationship with, but yeah, I just think it'd mean more coming from someone who somewhat knows them, obviously.
Mr. Marshall.
Maybe if we pick the date, then we could, as we send it out there to hold the space, actually do an RSVP. I know most people don't even understand what that means, but just to reply that it is on their calendar and they plan on joining that final decision-making meeting. Sometimes it helps. And I think if you can get it out there far enough and just ask them to, the kind reply would be appreciated. That might work. Second question is, because we don't have a quorum, Joe, do you want a recommendation from the committee as to what I think you've got it all kind of marked down as to what you want to do that way. Would you rather have a recommendation, which certainly isn't a motion, but it's a recommendation from the committee to go in that direction?
Well, certainly, Mr. Marshall, before we had closed tonight's meeting, I was hoping to summarize the items that the department will provide for the next meeting and potentially the final meeting. And after I do the summary, if there is a consensus, I certainly would appreciate that direction.
Sounds good.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
Well, just
Mr.
thank you. One additional request would be that the one or two, if we do an alternate version of the final, be circulated when it's ready, so that the task force members can weigh in or at least become familiar with it, so that we are prepared to take a final vote at the next meeting.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea to kind of maybe kick some ideas via email and hopefully come in with something that we're all fairly comfortable with as a final product, so we can vote and, bring it to a close.
And to the task force members and Mr. Glasky, I think that's an excellent suggestion. And my hope would be that if we're here at the beginning of November, sometime either early December or no later than mid-December, you'd have the product in draft form to begin your review.
So Joe, you want to summarize then what your plans are, I guess, heading into that last meeting, and then we can all, we're not voting, but can smile and give a thumbs up or something about it and adjourn.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. First and foremost, we will reformat the Excel worksheet into an 8.5 by 11 inch type format that will have less information, but more the pertinent information necessary for someone to utilize the service or access the volunteer opportunity. And secondly, we would have the criteria for inclusion on the list, which was just one of the items just discussed. And then finally, I'm drawing a blank on the third item.
It's basically talking to the city, whomever, John Young, whoever, about the potential of hosting in some way, shape, or form.
And then the hosting. Yes. So the third item would be just the results of discussions with potential hosts, and then kind of where we can go with the organizational chart once complete. Apologies.
No worries at all. Yes, Mr. Bosky.
Thank you. And one additional request would be to gather the additional information that's currently missing from the Excel spreadsheet, in particular, a brief description of the nature or purpose of the organization or the services they provide, and yes or no on whether there are volunteer opportunities.
Cool. One thing we skipped, and then Travis, was there ever anybody that wanted to comment, like public participation stuff? No.
No, sir.
Thank you. So yeah, I guess we're not voting on anything, but would you normally vote to adjourn, but now we just turn it off and say see you later?
Well,
You
just
could
one
say the
last,
meeting, yeah. You could
Yeah.
say the meeting was completed at that particular time. Yeah.
Okay.
just one last item, members of the task force. I'm going to try to get you an email before the end of the week that just summarizes the things we just talked about. Those 4 or 5 items that will be basically the focus of our next meeting. So that if I've missed something or mischaracterized it, please let me know. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. I think we're done. Whether
Have a
you
good
like it
evening.
or not. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yeah,
You too.
likewise.
Have a great holiday.